So welcome everyone to the Systematic and Scoping Review Workshop series. This is part one, Getting Started and Structured Searching. So my name is Prabjot Gill. I'm a librarian at Woodward Library, and I also have my co-presenters here, librarian Helen Brown and librarian Catherine Miller. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that UBC and Vancouver are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We thank them for caring for these lands and waters since time immemorial. We would also like to acknowledge the research being done and the knowledge held by Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh researchers and knowledge keepers. So these are just kind of our learning objectives today. So by the end of this workshop, you will know key differences between literature reviews, systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and just other types of knowledge synthesis. You will know the steps of a systematic or scoping review. You will be aware of resources for how to develop a protocol and where to register a protocol. And you will also know how to draft a rigorous, reproducible, and comprehensive search strategy for your reviews as well. So this is kind of our aims for today. This is the rough breakdown. So we have our overview of knowledge synthesis studies and steps to take. That will take about 20-25 minutes. Then we'll do a search demo. Then there'll be a break. After the break, we'll go into our breakout rooms, which again, participation is mandatory. You're free to just sit and listen as well. And we're gonna wrap it up by going over some resources for creating your protocol and your search strategy as well. Okay, so let's start by definition. So what is the definition of a systematic review? So this is a definition from Cochrane. And Cochrane says that a systematic review attempts to identify, appraise, and synthesize all the empirical evidence that meets pre-specified eligibility criteria to answer a given research question. Researchers conducting systematic reviews use explicit methods aimed at minimizing bias in order to produce more reliable findings that can be used to inform decision-making. So there will be many links to resources and guidebooks in these slides. All of these links, including the slides themselves, are in the Systematic Reviews and Scoping Reviews LibGuide, the research guide. So everything we talk about today is also touched on in some way in that guide as well. And there's also a link to the Cochrane Handbook, which is going to be a very useful reference as you carry out your reviews as well. And yeah, so if one of my colleagues can just put a link to the research guide into the chat, that would be great. And then, so that's a systematic review. And so in terms of scoping reviews then, scoping reviews map the literature on a research question. So they often have a broader research question than systematic reviews, which the systematic reviews generally focus on a more specific question. And scoping reviews usually do not appraise the quality of the included studies, unlike systematic reviews. So conducting a scoping review uses many of the same methods as a systematic review, such as producing a comprehensive and replicable search strategy, as well as a systematic screening process. So again, systematic review, generally a focused research question. Scoping review, you don't necessarily have a specific research question. You're just kind of mapping the literature. You're just kind of seeing what type of research is out there on a given topic. And so this is just a chart comparing some similarities and really some differences between a systematic review and a literature review. A literature review can also be referred to as a narrative review. And so I'm not going to read out the whole chart, but you have some differences there. And this chart is also in the Systematic Review, Scoping Review Research Guide, which is linked up here as well. And regardless, you need to include, if you're doing a systematic review, you need to include unpublished or gray literature. So Cochrane requires this in their reviews. I mean, it's not like an absolute requirement, but it is recommended that in addition to published research studies, you also include unpublished materials. And anything that's unpublished, so not published in like a journal, is generally referred to as grey literature. And grey literature will be talked about more in depth in part 2 of this workshop series. But the amount of grey literature that you include will vary substantially based on your research question. And so when it comes to developing a search, you want to make sure that you have a very comprehensive search, which means that you have to, search a minimum of about 3 databases, I would say 2 to 3 databases, as well as searching grey literature sources. You also have to include and exclude based on your clearly stated criteria. So you'll have to develop inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria for your systematic review. And sometimes it can be challenging to write out good inclusion exclusion criteria. So I recommend looking at the Cochrane guides, which are very helpful in defining that type of criteria. And really, the more rigorous your inclusion exclusion criteria is, the easier your screening process will be. And yeah, so just move on. So in terms of other synthesis methods, so like I mentioned before, there are other types of reviews beyond just systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and then the narrative literature reviews that we kind of touched on. There's a systematic review might include a meta-analysis, which pools and analyzes data from the included studies. So some meta-analyses do not include a systematic review of literature. There are also many other types of reviews themselves, such as rapid reviews. So rapid reviews are quicker to complete. So systematic reviews can take up to 12 to 18 months. It can take up to a year or more to complete a systematic review or a scoping review. So rapid reviews are really ideal for topics where you need an answer quickly. Example, COVID-19. And the typical rapid review length, Cochrane says generally 1 to 6 months. 1 to 6 months, it can even take anywhere from like 3 months as well, generally. But if you only have a couple of months, a few months to do a review, a rapid review is probably a better option, because systematic reviews, you really do need to dedicate a lot more time. There's also realist reviews. So a realist review applies a realist approach to knowledge synthesis. So, what works for whom under what circumstances. So realist reviews use theory to explore how contexts such as cultural norms and values, economic conditions, geographic characteristics, or national policy interacts with various mechanisms to produce outcomes. So essentially, you're looking at a specific context and how it influences the specific outcome you're looking at. So it's a different type of review. You also have integrative reviews. So the term integrative review is often used interchangeably with systematic review. However, there are some differences between them. So the major differences are their purpose and scope and the types of literature that's included, as well as the time and resources that are needed to execute. So an integrative review allows for more diverse research. It can contain theoretical literature, methodological literature in order to address the aim of the review. But sometimes they are used kind of interchangeably. And so, now that you kind of know there are different types of reviews out there, and they take, different kinds of effort and skill set. So before you start your knowledge synthesis project, consider the question, is this research question important enough to require a systematic review? Is a systematic review the right methodology? Or is another type of review a better fit for your specific question, as well as your specific time constraints and all of that? You also want to consider, is there already a systematic review on this topic? Are there enough high quality studies with diverse study participants to pool the data in a way that will be meaningful and helpful in practice? For example, are there only a few studies and do they all look at similar populations? When what you really need is data that can provide information about the broader population. Consider, are the stakeholders or are patients involved in this research? Who is the systematic review for? Do they want it? Are they participating? How will the results of their systematic review be used? Why are you doing it? And really, these are just questions to consider because you want your systematic review to be useful and to contribute to addressing knowledge gaps within the research. So, if it's not useful or if it's not going to be applied or if the work has been done before, you're essentially going to undertake on a lot of work for nothing. And so I'm going to start another poll, and I just want you to consider this sample systematic review research question. And so today we're using a relatively recent, and it's a fairly highly cited systematic review as an example. And I want you to read this question. Is this research question appropriate for the type of review? So I'm just going to launch the poll now. And it seems like it's pretty almost split down the middle. So we have around 30%. So a third of you think that yes, this question as how it's presented is appropriate for systematic review. Another third say no, it's not. And another third or so of you are unsure, which is totally fine. So I'm going to end the poll now. And the answer is actually no, because, and it's quite tricky, but the first two parts of the question, so A, assemble the body of literature available regarding the prevalence of needle fear and phobia, and B, summarize the prevalence of needle fear and phobia across demographic and clinical factors. These first two components, A and B, are really talking about assembling the literature, summarizing the literature. This is more appropriate for a scoping review or a mapping review. It's not, if you read it again, it's not looking at a specific research question. It's about looking at what research is out there, summarizing it in order to see, what the research looks like. But it's not really appropriate for a systematic review. So. And of course, if you have questions about your own research questions and you're unsure what type of review would be appropriate, feel free to reach out to your subject librarian at any time, because it can be tricky to decide sometimes. Okay, so now let's just kind of go through the steps of conducting a systematic or scoping review. And everything is kind of from the Cochrane Handbook again. So stage 1, you want to plan the review. So first things first, you want to form a review team, and you need at least one other person. You cannot do a systematic or scoping review by yourself. You need at least another person to help you. You also want to do exploratory searches and develop the research question. So this is like your preliminary searching. You should have a good idea of what you will find so that you can plan what type of review you will do. Are there enough high quality studies? What will the data extraction process look like, etc. You also will want to write and register a protocol. So a protocol is essentially a really detailed list of what you are planning to do. And it's basically a blueprint of your systematic review. And it's a thorough process with the goal of eventually registering it in a protocol repository, such as Prospero, Open Science Framework, UBC Circle, which I'll talk about later as well. You can also publish protocols in certain journals. And often having the protocol published or registered beforehand is required when you want to eventually publish the review. So it's always good to look at potential journals that you're wanting to publish in to see what they require, and then maybe essentially publish your protocol in those journals. In that journal. So basically it timestamps your research idea, It reduces bias. It lets others know that you are already working on this review. This review is in progress. And so it ensures that no one else kind of works on this review as well at the same time as you. And it really just holds you accountable and ensures that you adhere to the methods that you lay out at the beginning. And so that kind of decreases the risk of you then going forward to change your methods or your research focus as you go on. So it just allows for greater transparency by kind of making sure that you're accountable and consistent to your protocol throughout the review process. And we'll talk about more about protocols later as well. Stage 2 is identify and evaluate studies. So this involves conducting a systematic, rigorous, comprehensive search and then screening the studies. And this is really what we will kind of focus on today as well. So it's important to speak with your subject librarian if possible and really invest some good time in this portion of the process. Stage 3 is extract and synthesize data. So consider who will be involved in data extraction and synthesis, whether you need to contact a statistician to help advise you, and how to manage your data and make it reproducible. So the library does run research data management workshops on a regular basis. So I suggest you kind of look at the library events calendar to see if there's any coming up anytime soon. But that is a resource available to you as well. And then stage 4 is report finding. So that's actually writing your paper and disseminating it to other researchers so everyone knows what you did and how you kind of contributed to the literature. So just kind of going back to protocols then, why and where do you register a protocol? So I kind of talked about the whys already. It's to avoid duplication of effort, making sure that you're kind of putting out there, I'm doing this review, and it kind of ensures that no one else kind of does the same thing as you. It increases transparency. You're laying out your methods, your intended methods, your methodology, and so this is exactly what I'm going to do. It reduces bias, and it raises awareness of your work prior to its publication. So these are just really just some examples of why it's a good idea to write and register a protocol. And it's really helpful for you as well. You can always refer to it throughout the review process to kind of remind you of what your plan was at the very beginning stages when you actually started planning your review. And again, registering protocols, this will be covered in more detail later in this workshop by my colleague, Catherine. So these are just examples of some places where you can register a protocol. So there's Prospero, and this is systematic reviews in health only, no scoping reviews. So it's generally systematic reviews or even rapid reviews as well, but it has to be within the health kind of field, health protocols only. There's Proceed. So Proceed is any review type, so it's not limited to systematic or rapid reviews. So it could be any review type, but it does generally focus on topics to do with environmental sciences. There's Open Science Framework. So again, Open Science Framework, any review type, any topic, and immediate registration is also possible. And Open Science Framework is a good option if you're doing like scoping reviews, for example, especially scoping reviews for like health or really any topic. If you're doing that type of thing, it's good to register an Open Science Framework. There's also UBC Circle, so that's UBC's own repository. And so you can also register your protocol there, and it could be any review type, any topic. And if just want to look at the systematic and scoping reviews research guide, has a list of some other kind of examples and places that you might want to register your protocol. But this is just so that you're aware that depending where you register, some repositories might be limited to the type of review and the topic. So something to keep in mind. Like I said before, several journals also publish protocols, and it's good to just kind of follow the guidelines from the journal that you're looking to publish in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about PRISMA and PRISMA reporting requirements. So PRISMA stands for the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And it's essentially a checklist of what you want to include in your review. So checklists from PRISMA have been adopted as best practices for reporting by many journals. So these are great guidelines to use. There's kind of like different iterations. So there's PRISMA P, and this is specifically for developing protocols. So it's a checklist on exactly what you need in your protocol. It's essentially up to and including the method section. So mapping out your methodology. There's just the regular Prisma or Prisma 2020, which was the last time it was updated. And Prisma is mainly for systematic reviews. And then there's also Prisma SCR, which is for scoping reviews. So there's different iterations of Prisma as well, but these are kind of like the main ones you might see. And all these guidelines and links are available on the systematic review research guide as well. There's also other guidelines for performing a review as well, in addition to Prisma. So there's, of course, Cochrane Handbook again. There's also Campbell Collaboration. So Cochrane is really good for health systematic reviews, and then Campbell Collaboration is really good for systematic reviews in the social sciences. There's also the Joanna Briggs Institute. So that's generally for health scoping and systematic reviews. And there's also the collaboration for environmental evidence as well. So that kind of summarizes the first portion of the workshop today. Are there any questions? Feel free to put them in the chat, but or you can just hold on to your questions and then you can we can discuss them when we get to the breakout rooms. But I will now pass it on to my colleague Helen, who will now do a search demo.
Okay, hello everybody. Sorry for the delay. So now I'm going to look at a search demonstration, and we're going to go over some of the searching capabilities that different databases use and what you might need to use in your preparing for your systematic review or scoping review or whatever type of evidence synthesis you're doing, and also when you're doing that preliminary searching and scoping out different topics that you're going to do. A lot of the work that we do tend to do in these types of reviews actually happens when we're creating that protocol. So by the time you're done your protocol, you will have a substantial amount of work completed as well. So one of the things that we usually use to start is some sort of conceptual framework. So this is some way of creating an answerable question that you can do for your search and for your review. And some of you may be familiar with this. PICO is perhaps the most famous. It's used in health and medicine. So I know that we usually have a lot of people who are involved in health and medicine in our workshops. It's also used in environmental evidence synthesis. There are also other options as well. So PCC, which takes into context into account a little bit more, SPICE, PESICO, SPIDER, Eclipse. There are actually at least 15, but probably more of these different types of frameworks that you can look up that might help to take into account different elements of your research study. So it could be things about stakeholders or education, for example, and different sorts of contexts that you want to look into. And basically what these frameworks do is they allow you to lay out your question in such a way that you make sure that it's answerable, and so that it then can be translated easily into a search that you can do. Okay. what you want to do is you want to take your topic of interest or your research question and really help to pull out the different concepts, that's what I'll call it for now, but the different components of your question. And this can help you to clarify and develop your research question, make sure that you're not, for example, asking multiple questions, or if you are, that you have a plan for how to deal with them, and to prepare for your initial search by brainstorming for relevant terms that you'll have to use. And this is a preliminary stage. It helps you to define your research question, and it will be something that you will report in your protocol and your review as well. So the example that I'm going to go with for today is PICO, because it is used so much in so many different fields. So generally with PICO, the P will stand for patient, problem, or population. The I will stand for intervention, item of interest, or possibly exposure. The C will be a comparison if there is one, and O will be related to outcome. And oftentimes your question ends up being kind of reframed as, among P, does I versus C affect O? Another way to think about this, if that's too confusing as you're getting started, you can also divide your question down into different concepts. So you can just call it concept 1, concept 2, concept 3, and start thinking about it that way. And this might be particularly helpful if you are in a field where there isn't a framework already developed and well used that really fits your research question. So an example question that I'm going to use is, how is resilience training being incorporated into post-secondary education? And this is more of an education example. So here's how I might work that out in a worksheet. So for example, concept 1 might be about resilience. And so I'd want to think of all of the different terms that relate to resilience, and that might include looking for maybe some of the ways that resilience would show. So maybe you're looking for different markers of well-being as well. The other thing is the second concept would be something about post-secondary education. Of course, we know that there are lots of different terms for post-secondary education. Authors may not use post-secondary education. They might just talk about universities, or they might talk about undergraduate students. And in that case, you might still want that research. It might be highly relevant, but they're going to be using different terminology. So thinking through all of the different possible synonyms for the concept that you're looking for. The third concept gets to the type of training that you're looking at. So is it training? Is it a course within the university program, for example? Is it a workshop, an intervention? How are the ways that you might describe this training, and how might others describe it as well? And we also want to make sure to include different variations of spelling or plurality. So university or universities, for example, or maybe if we were doing something related to pediatrics, sometimes the different spellings of that term, is we want to always take those things into account. You'll also notice that in that sheet, we were using something called Boolean logic. And so we were using and or in particular. And so I just wanted to pause for a moment and look at and or. These are really useful ways for combining subject headings and keywords and different types of terms within our search. So or, for example, is something that you would use to combine all the different terms within one of your concepts. So if we were looking at the post-secondary component of our research question, we might want to capture university or college, or undergraduate, or undergraduates, or universities. And so we want to kind of look for all of the different variations of those terms. And then what we want to do is we want to build up our search for each component of our research, and then we want to combine it together. So we want to end up with a search that is ultimately taking into account all of the different components or concepts within our research question. So we want it to ultimately be about resilience and universities and post-secondary education. So when you do that, when you combine two concepts together, you decrease the amount of results that you get, because you're making sure that hopefully everything that you've retrieved is substantively about both of those two components of your research question. Not is another operator that we can use often in searching. We don't tend to use it actually in evidence synthesis searches, but we do tend to use it when we are testing those searches and when we're coming up with some of our preliminary materials. So it's something that we would use very much with caution if in our final searches that we were running, but we would use it a lot when we were testing our searches to make sure that they were robust and that they were capturing what we wanted them to capture. And part of the reason why we don't use it in our final searches is because it can accidentally exclude relevant research. Another thing that we talk about a lot with systematic reviews and scoping reviews is precision versus sensitivity. So a precise search would capture the material that is really substantively about our research, and we would have very few irrelevant results. And that means, and that's a wonderful thing if you're doing a quick literature search or you're just trying to find some evidence on a particular topic. But the problem is that it will also miss quite a bit of the research. A sensitive search, however, will capture hopefully all of the research on that topic, or it won't capture quite all, but it'll get most of it. But it will also capture quite a few irrelevant results as well. And some topics have to be very sensitive by the nature of the research question, and other ones, if the terminology and the topics that you're searching for and that you need to include for your research are more precisely defined, then it can be more of a precise search. But generally speaking, we want to find a balance between precision and sensitivity, with the understanding that these sorts of reviews are meant to be comprehensive. So we are looking to try to find all of the evidence on a particular topic. That is more of a goal than a reality, but we want to try to make it as comprehensive as possible. The other thing that we want to do is we want to search for existing reviews and protocols. So if someone has already published a review and it's well conducted and it's recent and it's on your topic, you most definitely want to know about that. And even if there are other reviews that are maybe a little bit out of date and whatnot, you might want to consider those, consider whether there might need to be some additions to that topic. Maybe you want to change your topic a little bit, or whether you want to collaborate with the authors, particularly if there is an ongoing review. And oftentimes when we register our protocols, we can see who is doing this work in these areas. And if there is a review on a topic similar to yours, you can look through their search strategy and see their included studies and use that information in developing not only your own research topic, but also potentially your own search. And we would just make sure to cite that work because of course it is work that they've completed and published. And if you find a protocol similar to yours, you might want to reach out to that team. And I now want to show you a demo. I'm going to show you a demo in a database called Medline, and it's going to be on the Ovid platform. So this is a database that is used in essentially all reviews in health and medicine, also in other topics that might have a health or a medicine component to them. Systematic reviews really developed in medical fields, in very particular fields related to interventions and RCTs. But we want to use this database just as an example that many people can then follow up on when they're doing their own reviews, but also because this platform has a lot of the tools that we would want to use. And these tools are also available in other databases. And so we just want to make sure that when we are using them at other databases, we just double check using either some help pages that might describe how the database works, or sometimes there's little question mark icons, or there's resource pages that you can find online, just to see how those databases might use those different functionalities and how it works within there. And you can always speak to librarians about that as well. So everything that I show you, even though it's going to be a little bit health focused, it should be translatable to other fields and databases as well. So the question that I'm going to look at is measuring dyspnea or breathlessness during exercise testing in people with lung disease. So it's quite a big question, a very health-focused question. So I'm going to kind of cut some corners and make it a little bit simpler just for a demonstration so that we can move along nicely. But it should be a question that can allow me to show you some of the features that you would want to use when you're doing these types of reviews. So the first thing I might like to do is to separate out my different parts of that question. So I'm probably going to be looking for dyspnea or breathlessness. I'm also going to be looking for lung disease or people with lung disease, and also exercise testing. So we'll look for each one of those and we're going to search for them individually. So I'm going to start with dyspnea. In this database, there are subject headings available. So we want to make sure that this little box that says map term to subject heading is checked off. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to search the database for a subject heading. It's a little bit different to how we might normally search. We'd expect some results and articles to pop up immediately. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm seeing if there's a subject heading here. And what that means is subject headings are essentially like tags that would be attached to an article as it was put into the database, saying one of the topics that it is substantively about. And usually articles will have a number of different subject headings attached to them. And they are a way of really easily and effectively linking to all of the research within that database that is on that topic. So in these types of reviews, we are expected to use subject headings when they are available in the database that we're using. And you can see that there are two terms here that are related. So I'm going to click on this first one here. And you can find out a little bit more about it. So these subject headings are created within sort of a classification or a tree structure, and that can tell you a little bit about what the term means. You can also see how many articles have that subject heading added to them, and you can click on a little information bubble to find out more about the subject heading. So in this case, it gives a scope note or definition. It also provides some other terminology that it is standing in for in this database. So everything that is about shortness of breath, breathlessness, dyspnea is going to have this subject heading attached to it. And that is the nice thing about subject headings, is that they adjust for all of that different terminology that people use. And it's just one term that will be used within the database. And I would want to note these down as well, because they might help me later when I'm making my keywords. I would also want to look at the other term here too. So this is potentially relevant as well, and I want to see that if it is. And for the sake of our search, I'm going to assume that it is. And I'm going to check off both of them and click continue. And that will put it into my search. And you can see here in this database, a subject heading is shown as having a slash after it that indicates that it is a subject heading. And you can also see that they've used some Booleans. So what the database has done is it's searched for dyspnea as a subject heading or dyspnea proximal as a subject heading. And it is taking any article that has one or both of those in it. I will also want to search for dyspnea. And one of the things that I can do, I'll just keep this simple for the moment. I also noticed that when I was in there, dyspnea was a term that was used, but also dyspnea, so it could also be plural. And so I'm going to use the asterisk as a form of truncation. So any term that has dyspnea as a root word with any ending, I will capture that just based on where I've put that truncation. And I will search this as a keyword. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to search not the subject headings necessarily, but other parts of the article record within the database. So here it has searched in the MP, I believe that stands for many places, and it could include the title, the abstract, and a number of other areas. In an evidence synthesis, it's also acceptable to narrow that down a little so that you are just looking within fields such as the title, the abstract, and the author added keywords. So I will do that as well. And I'll show you how to change that. So I can edit my search and I can actually determine which fields I'm going to look in. So instead of that general search, I'm going to make it more specific, and I'm going to search within the abstract, title, and author added keywords only. And that will just help to narrow my search a little bit. I can also search for breathlessness. And I can search for some other variations of the terms. So for example, some authors might be describing this as a shortness of breath or breath shortness, or there might be different ways that, or shortness of the breath. There might be different ways that people are articulating things. And sometimes we can be a little bit surprised by how many different variations there can be. So in one region or another, or in one field, or depending on where you've studied and whatnot, you might have very different ways of describing something than someone else. So we have to think of all of the different variations that people in many different fields and places would be using. And so one of the ways that we can do this and to adjust for different variations in the closeness of the terms to one another is to use adjacency searching. This is a tool that's available in most databases, but it will show up a little bit differently. In this case, it says 80J, so for adjacency, and then I've added a number there. So what I'm telling the database in this case is that I want breadth to be adjacent within 3 words of shortness. And it could be either or. So it could be that shortness comes before breadth or that breadth comes before shortness. It's not particular about the order of the words, just how close together they are. And that 3, I did sort of make that up. So what I would also want to test is I would want to run this search again and see what happens if I change that number to 2 or to 4 or to 5. And is that relevant to my research? If I do change it to 4, am I getting relevant results that I need to include? In that case, that would be one of the ways that I would test that search. That's where not comes in handy. And I can then compare the different results and decide on which variation of that search term that I'm going to use. If I sort of, assume for now that this is good enough, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to combine all of my terms for this concept. So what I do is I take all of the terms that I've come up with, the subject headings, the keywords, and I combine them with OR. And what I'm telling the database is I want any of the terms related to this component of my research topic. So I've searched just that one component, and as you can see, I've got almost 70,000 results. The next thing that I want to do is search for maybe the component related to lung diseases. So that was an important part of the research topic. And so I want to see if there are any subject headings for lung diseases, and there will be quite a few. So I'll go and take a look at them. For the sake of just being brief today, I will just assume that they are all relevant and we'll include them all in our search. But what I would want to do if I was doing this would be to open up all of these subcategories, narrower terms here, take a look at all of them, look at the scope notes for all of them, and make sure that I was developing keywords for all of these as well, and just remove any of the ones that are not particular to the topic that I'm looking at. In order to include all of them, though, for today, I'll just click explode, which will include all of my narrower terms. But if I was doing this and I wanted to be a little bit more accurate, I would go through and check off all of them so that they can all be listed in my search as well. And I'll click continue. And there we have lung disease. I would also want to create keywords for this, of course. So one of the things that I would have to do is think of all of the different ways that you can articulate this. I'm going to keep this part very sparse for the moment, just for time. But what I will do is look for pulmonary disease or lung disease. And I've used truncation here, so it could be lung disease or lung diseases. And I'm also searching just within the title, the abstract, and the author added keywords. And then I can combine the terms for my second concept or component of my search. And you can see this one was quite a large one. Oftentimes we get the question about how long searches are going to be in terms of like how many search lines there are. You can see that I have 8 so far, and actually it varies very much by the topic. So if I were doing this one and I really was looking at a wide variety of lung diseases, it would be substantively longer. And the length of the search line really just has to do with how you're organizing your search, and not at all, there's no requirement or limit to how long it can be. It really just depends on your topic and how complex it is. So another part of the search was related to exercise testing. So I will look for a subject heading related to that as well. And I can see there's one here for exercise test, which is probably going to be relevant. And I can go over here and check out the scope note for it. It will give me a definition, of course. It will also tell me, for most of the terms, it will tell you when the concept or when the subject heading was added into the database. So in this case, it was added in 1966, and they actually went back and they indexed articles back to 1963. So they added a few more years. It also gives me lots of different suggestions for other terms that I might like to use. And I would want to keep those in mind when I'm creating my keywords. And generally speaking, I actually copy and paste those terms into a document and work with them there to kind of help to draft my keywords. I think also probably walk test is going to be relevant. So we can take a look at that and make sure that we see it is here. It was only added in 2017, so it's a relatively new term. And these terms will change over time. I will include both of those for now, and we'll continue on to my search page. And I can also create some keywords here. So again, I'll keep it fairly brief, but here's what that might look like. So I can, for example, look for exercise or exercises, fitness or step or walk or stress. Adjacent within 3 words of test or capacity. And there's probably going to be lots of other variations that I can come up with for this. So I want to kind of get to whatever sort of exercise that you are actually testing. And then the fact that it is some sort of a test or a measuring of capacity or a measurement, and list all of those different terms. And you can try out different variations and test them to see how useful they are for getting to the research that's on your topic. And you can see that I've used brackets in here as well. It works in the same way that it works in math in terms of grouping the different terms. And I can, of course, combine my third concept as well with or. And then once I have that, once I have all of the different components of my research question, I can combine them together. And this is where we use and, because we want to tell the database to find all of the research on dyspnea, all of the research on lung disease, and all of the research on exercise testing. And you can see that I got 2,813 results, and you can scroll down and look at them. And then at this point, we would also do quite a bit of testing of our different terms, and we might try out how changing different terms would actually impact the number of results that we get, and then we can look at the differences in terms of what it retrieved and see whether they're relevant or not, whether it added anything that we would want to capture. One thing that you might have heard of when you're doing when you're using databases at all is some sort of a limit or refinement tool. So you can see that those are available here within the database. It gives you some here, such as full text or humans. There's also additional limits where it will expand on them quite a bit more. And oftentimes, we tend not to use these sorts of limits in an evidence synthesis review. It's a good place to check in with a librarian because we can identify which limits are going to be reliable for this type of search and which ones you may want to avoid using. And what we often tend to use instead is a filter or a search hedge that's been developed to be as comprehensive as possible. And that helps us to avoid accidentally removing materials from our search, from our results that we should actually include. Now, Ovid does have some special filters that they've designed on specific topics, so those are worthwhile looking at. And again, it just might be a time to talk to a librarian. Okay. Another really useful tool within the database is to go into your account. So you can create an account. It has nothing to do with access, but what it does allow you to do is to save your searches, which is very helpful. So for example, if I log into my account, I can go to my workspace. And you can see that it's signed me in here. And once I'm here, I can click on searches and alerts, and I can see my previous searches, and I can see them listed here. There's also an ability to flag some of them that are your favorite, for example. So I can actually save this search. So I'll do that now. I'm going to Ovid is a platform, and there's quite a few databases that use Ovid. So I'm going to specify the database that I'm using. I'm going to say it's an example search. Maybe it's for the systematic review. And I always like to put a date as well. And I could say that it is, it's a test search. It's just, I'm just beginning my process here. And I'm going to save it as a permanent search for now, but if this was my final search and it was ready to run and I was running it within all of my databases and then exporting all of those results into something like Covidence, I would then also set it up as an auto alert. We do expect these reviews to be up to date within 6 months of publication. And so what you want to do is set up the database so that it reruns the search for you automatically. It pulls out any new results and it emails them to you. And that way you can then screen them and filter them back into your review if necessary in order to keep your review up to date. And once we have these saved searches, sorry, I'm just going to scroll a fair bit. Okay, so here we are. We can rerun it. We could also edit it, for example. So I can come back in here. I could add another search line. So say I found some terms that I had missed and I need to add those back in. I can do so here, and it keeps the integrity of the search and how I've structured it intact. I can also change things. So for example, if I just needed to add some more terms to my keywords, I can do that as well using the edit function. So I can just make changes there and then rerun that search and save it again. I also mentioned search filters versus limits. So I just want to show you an example of that. So for example, the Cochrane Handbook has some search filters available that are to identify randomized control trials and also something called the human filter. So if I was looking for, let's say I was working in medical genetics, for example, and I had a lot of research that was coming in about animals and I wanted to exclude that, I wanted to just limit it to research about humans, there are search filters to enable you to do that. So here is an example of how you would add that together. So this is the full search, and then you would add that animal and human filter to it. And this is actually part of the randomized control trial filter. So there are quite a few available. So I noticed that someone was doing work on child populations. So there are pediatric search filters available, for example, and you would just want to speak with a librarian about finding one and potentially modifying it to fit your research area. Another thing that we can do is we can use, if you are using PubMed, so if you are using Medline and you're working in health and sciences, we can also use something called the Yale Mesh Analyzer. It pulls information from PubMed. And what we would do is we would grab a PubMed ID number in Ovid. This is actually, they just rename it to be helpful. It's actually called the unique identifier number, but it's the same number. And what we can do is we can put those into our Yale Mesh Analyzer, and what it will do is it will give us a spreadsheet with all those articles that we've deemed to be substantively on our topic that we want to take into account. And we can actually use this to pick out any terms that we might need to include. So you can look through the title, the abstract, and the subject headings, which you can see some of them here, and then also any author added keywords just to see if there are more terms that you need to include in your search. And that is also something that you can do just through your preliminary searching or from any known articles that you're already aware of that you would want to then make sure that you capture with your search. And you can look at all of them and see what kinds of terms are being used. Is there any way that I can expand my search to make sure that I'm getting, not just the articles that I've already found, but all of the studies that I haven't yet found. So you want to kind of always think about just making sure that it's as comprehensive as it can be. Another thing that we can do is create a test search. So if there are articles that you know that you would want to include, I'm just going to assume that this one is one of them, we can search for that. Oh, try a different one. So you just want to make sure that it's available within the database, and you'll get a list here. So we can grab a couple of articles here just for showing how it works. Okay, and we can put these together. And then what we can do is we can combine that with our search. And if we know that these are articles that we want to include, that we want to make sure that we capture, then we can either combine it with and or. And we're just making sure that we actually did capture it with our search. So I used and there, and what I've said to the database is it has to be captured within this search right here, which is all of my search terms, and it has to be in this list of my kind of gold standard or test search papers that I've found. And in this case, I've found both of them, but you might find that you don't find some of them. And then you want to look at that research study or paper that you found and realize like, why did your search not capture it? And is there a way that you can improve your search? And I just want to, before we take a break, I want to just try just a poll here, where we're going to look at this question in particular. So this is this is a systematic review that was done in the health sciences, and the purpose of it was to assemble a body of literature available regarding the prevalence of needle fear and phobia, summarize the prevalence of needle fear and phobia across demographic and clinical factors, and assess the degree of vaccination avoidance because of needle fear. So they actually had multiple research questions that they were looking at, and they created a search. And with all of these types of evidence synthesis studies, we want to report our search, and so they have done so. And what I'm going to ask is just that we do a quick assessment of this search. So what issues might you see with the search strategy, and just check any that apply. So a lack of necessary keywords, inappropriate mesh terms, error in the Boolean logic, or error in the use of a limit or a filter. Okay, so I'm going to end that and I'll share the results. Okay, so let's see here. So this is a really interesting search. One of the things that I didn't warn you about, which is probably one of the things that is probably most confusing about this search, is that it specifies the database as Medline, but it doesn't specify the platform. And they've actually done the search on PubMed. And I can tell that just by the way that it's articulated here, the way that it's laid out. It looks quite a bit different than how our search looked using Ovid. And so PubMed is actually how Medline is typically shown to people, but the Ovid platform is another way that you can search largely the same content, and it has a different layout. And in systematic reviews, it's really important that we specify not just the database, but also the interface that we're using. It impacts how we're able to affect those searches, but also how what literature we're searching. So you want to be quite specific about that. So we want to make sure that we specify that it is PubMed. The keywords don't fully cover the topic or include terms like fear or phobia or needles that were in the research question. Instead, they include very specific terms like blood injection symptom scale. And so there might be a need to really adjust those terms, and there's no use of things like truncation. So minor variations like injuries might not be captured, and there are no keywords for some concepts. The mesh term, for example, is limited to major topic. That is something that is too narrow. So that means that when the subject heading was attached to the article, there was a little box that was ticked that identified it as a major topic of the article. And actually, when we're doing evidence synthesis searching, we want to search more broadly than that. So we don't generally use major topic when we're doing this type of searches. They also don't cover anxiety, which is probably necessary. And I know that there are quite a few subject headings related to anxiety, for example. And the terms don't relate to vaccine avoidance, which I think would be relevant in this case. I believe the Boolean does actually work out, but it is quite confusing. It hasn't been really structured by the different components of the research question. And there is a human limit that is used. And so that is probably just the one that is available within the database. Here it shows that it is a mesh term, and that's how that limit works within PubMed. But we would actually want to use a human filter like the one available from Cochrane if we were going to be more comprehensive. Okay. And that is all that I want to show you for now. We will take a break. We'll take a 5-minute break and come back at let's say 2:11, and we'll go into breakout rooms at that point. And if you would like to take a longer break and not go to breakout rooms, that is perfectly fine. And if you would like to practice during that time or ask any questions, please feel free. We will link you up with librarians working in your areas or in a related field, and you can ask any questions that you want about your particular research area, your questions about any of the things that we've talked about, or any other questions that you have. And then after we've ended the breakout rooms, we will come back and have a bit more of a presentation about how to resources and critical components for a rigorous and reproducible search and study protocol. Okay, so see you back here in a few minutes.
Thank you, and welcome back, everyone. Before we continue, I wanted just to touch base with the group. If there was any questions which came out of those breakout rooms that you wanted to share with the group.
One question that came up was just about choosing the right research question, I think, and the right research study design, and for the topic that you have, and just looking at the types of resources that you have available for helping to decide on what sort of type of review you're going to be doing. And one part of that was whether or not you can include gray literature. And I know that that's going to be a part of our part 2 next week, but gray literature is considered to be an essential part of these types of reviews. So I just wanted to mention that again. And for some reviews, it might almost be the majority of the research that you're looking at, because it really just depends on who's doing that research and where they might be publishing it more than anything else. And I always like to think of it in terms of the object of study of these types of studies, these review studies that we're doing, is actually the study and not the journal article or publication type. We're just using those publications as a way of finding that underlying study and finding that data that we would then use for pulling it together for our own research purposes.
Thank you, Helen. Was there anything, Prabjot, that came out of your group that you wanted to bring back, or is no problem if not?
There was one interesting question. So a student is doing a like a research project as part of their program, and they have to submit a research proposal. And their project is like a rapid review, and they have to submit a research proposal like for 2 pages. And they're just wondering if there's any resources to help them with that. I kind of considered the thesis there, like from UBC graduates, there's a thesis proposal guideline. I considered that, and I also consider Prisma P, because Prisma P is essentially like you know, a protocol is essentially like a proposal for the review you're type to you want to do. So is that like, do you or Helen have any ideas about that beyond Prisma P for a research proposal?
I like your ideas very much, and I don't have any further ones at this time.
Okay.
I would just maybe say, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
If there's any outlines for that research proposal, like if it was for a grant, for example, they might have specifics that they were looking for, but using the standards for developing a protocol might be a good way to go about it. And you'd probably just need to have it be a bit shorter, but you might want components in a protocol that you don't necessarily want to have in your research proposal. So it might be that you're able to pull from different sections.
Yeah, their guidelines were really broad, like develop a research proposal in 2 pages. So I'm like, okay, you can start with Prisma P, take some stuff from the thesis proposal, and then just kind of go from there. But okay, that's good to know that I wasn't missing anything major. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, the Center for scholarly communication and writing at UBC might also be a help as well. They work very closely with graduate students a lot of the time, but also with other researchers. And so they might be good to connect with as well.
Oh, right. Thanks, Helen. I'll link that in the chat.
Thank you both. We'll continue now with our slides, and those slides will be shared after the workshop. We're going to let's get rid of this, and we're going to do one more poll. So again, we're looking at search methods which were reported, and the question is, are they appropriate for a systematic review? So if you can take a moment just to quickly scan through this and think about, are there any things that you might do differently? And I will launch that poll. The question is, are the search methods comprehensive and appropriate for a systematic review? So there's some things which are missing, and as you might have suspected, there's some things that we would be hoping to see there. So some of the things that are missing. This was mentioned earlier around the importance of identifying the platform that you're using. So this author or these authors have identified that they're searching in specific databases, but they haven't identified the platform. So for example, Medline is available on multiple different platforms, and that syntax changes. As well, PsycInfo is on various platforms as well. So a key thing to be thinking about when you're writing up your methods is to be including that platform. One of the other things that we've just been recently chatting about is around the importance of, for some questions, of including gray literature. So gray literature will be discussed further in some of the other, I think the next workshop is the one where it's covered. But in this case, that was missing from this this method section. I'm just wondering if everyone can just check to make sure you're muted. If you, I think we might have one person with a mic on. Additionally, in this methods, they talk about the search terms included Boolean logic and controlled vocabularies to retrieve terms. And that kind of level of detail is not needed in the methods. In the methods section, it's to be expected that we would be employing subject headings and Boolean operators, so that's not needed. Additionally, they've given more details around that there was no language restrictions, nor were there any restrictions by age, gender, race, or country of origin. So again, this level of detail would not be needed. If they had used language restriction, that would be something that would need to be reported. But the fact that they did not use it would not normally be something that we would include. We haven't, I don't think, talked about this yet around the idea that it's the importance of having your searches peer reviewed using something like Press, and that's something that a librarian can also sometimes support you with. So there's no mention of the search strategy having been peer reviewed. And I think those are some of the key things. Also around chaining. So a great strategy is to include both forward chaining and backward chaining, which means looking up the references in the key papers that you're including, looking up those references, and also doing forward chaining. So in this case, they've used backward chaining, but they haven't used forward chaining. Forward chaining, which says those key papers that you found, how have they been cited in papers which come after it. So there's some missed opportunities here, and the reason we emphasize this is the methods needed for systematic and scoping reviews are to be really comprehensive in the searching. So some things to be thinking about when you're building your own process for your systematic or scoping review. I'm going to continue now. So resources for creating your protocol and your search strategy. So coming back to the research guide that we have at UBC Library, I'll jump into there in just one moment, but just the key takeaways want to make sure that everybody is clear about is the importance of including a librarian on your research team or consulting with the librarian or another information specialist who may have those skills. One of the questions which sometimes comes up in the breakout rooms is around, do I need to search in more than just one database? I'm searching comprehensively in Medline. I might have done a Google Scholar search. Do I need to go further? And the answer is that yes, in fact, it's really important to be including multiple databases in our searches, and contemplating whether gray literature would also be an added value for your research question. Here's the link to PRESS, which is the peer review of electronic search strategies, so that you can see more about that, some of the criteria that's reviewed. And so now to talk a little bit more about the protocol. So as you know or may have heard, there is the Prisma P, which helps you to guide you with the process of creating your protocol. It is highly recommended that you go through those steps in that protocol. It allows you at the beginning of the process to ask and come to conclusions with your team about many of the pieces of the research question that you're going to be asking, and where you're going to be searching, and what the actual syntax will be. And let's take a look at the research guide for a little more information and links there. So we've been using some of the materials here already, and it's in the Writing Your Methods section that you'll see more information about some of the Prisma guidance around protocols, and also around the process in general. So the protocol, the Prisma P is here under drafting your protocol, and you can see that more in depth here. And then under the Writing the Methods section, we can see, for example, the Prisma 2020 checklist. It's going to open that one up and highlight the expanded checklist, which I find very helpful for explaining the components of these, of what is recommended. So I do encourage you to take a look at the expanded checklist as well. It just gives more details, and will be giving you guidance about what each of the sections should be including within those. I'm going to just bring us back. Sorry, one moment. So back in the guide. So in addition to the Prisma 2020 checklist, I'd like to quickly point out the Prisma flow diagram. Partially because by looking at that, this is something that you'll report within your review. By taking a look at that visual, it can be really helpful for sort of understanding what's happening with the process. It's, so here's the flow chart that you would be creating, and you can see here in the first column, you would be reporting the studies that you found via databases and registries. So you would literally be identifying the number of articles that you found in Medline, in PsycInfo, and various databases that you've searched, or in registries. And then you would see, you'd be reporting how many duplicates were removed and what was your final number that you're screening. So we go through first the title abstract screening of those results after they've been deduplicated, and then you identify the number which were excluded as being not relevant. And then we would go next to the full text screening, and then identifying the number which were eligible or not eligible. And so your inclusion and exclusion criteria are really key for this piece. And then also in the second column here, you'll see the studies might be identified through other methods. So this is getting at gray literature. So by searching websites, organizations, their websites, or if there's a citation forward and backwards. So these are some of the different techniques that we might be using to find the literature through other methods. And then you can see that we would be identifying how many we were actually going to go to the actual full text of that report, perhaps. And then assessing again for eligibility using the inclusion and exclusion criteria and identifying here how many were excluded and how many were included. And then your final set of papers that will be included and taken through the next steps of the systematic review process. I'm going to head back now to our slides. Sorry, it can sometimes get to be a little confusing with all the things open. Let me just bring that down again. So those were the key things that I wanted to sort of highlight here in the guide itself. And back to our slides. So some key components to consider for your review. The relevant research question. So you want to make sure that the question that you're asking hasn't been asked already, or it's been a while since it was asked, and you may be updating that systematic review or scoping review. The second point is around the importance of working in a team. Some of you may be working on your dissertation or your master's and be contemplating doing a scoping or systematic review, and to be aware that these methods are really best done by a team. So thinking about partnering with your advisor or other students in similar situations, or perhaps you've received grant funding and can hire students to support your work as well. Ensuring every decision is informed and methodologically sound. So asking for help when you need it. There's help within the library and from your advisor and others to support you with that. This also speaks to the importance of it being transparent, and part of the methods is to be creating something which is reproducible, search strategies which are reported and reproducible, and that is discussed in more detail in the Prisma S, which refers to the search component of your review. So there's lots of guidance there in the Prisma S to make sure that that is transparent. A well-planned protocol to direct your study. So you may be wanting just to get to it, and I want to emphasize how important it is to do that pre-work of the conversation with the team, and actually this becomes another publication, so you may find that of value as well. Thorough and exhaustive searches to minimize bias. So part of the reason that we've gone into that detail of discussing how each database we need to use the full power of those databases to find the literature. That's part of the methods, and with the goal of minimizing bias. Consider all the places where bias can enter your study, and part of the reason for including gray literature is to be reducing the bias. Documented and reproducible searches and methods, we've discussed that, but it's a very important piece. It's to document your choices. As you go through the search, you will be making many choices, and to keep track of that for yourself and for reporting in methods. Quality studies to synthesize. So the critical appraisal piece will be reviewed in the third workshop. So we'll go into more detail there. And appropriate data synthesis that will also be discussed in more detail in workshop number 3. Knowledge translation is again around the reporting of your methods and the clarity of that. For consideration, as well as including the patients and or this other stakeholders as collaborators in all aspects of your research. This is becoming more and more important, and to consider that as you're building your team. And finally, identifying the limits of your research, and also explaining when you've made choices such as a publication date limits or limiting by language, to be explaining why that limit is a justified limit. Just going to continue we've mentioned that there's a couple of other workshops, and those links to register will be put into the chat, or maybe already there. So the next one next week is translating database searches and finding the gray literature. So in that workshop, you will be executing a search strategy in multiple databases. So it's really wonderful to come to this next workshop with a search that you have conducted, that you can then practice the translating of that search into other databases. So there'll be more guidance as well about how to plan and execute your gray literature search, and how to document your search. Part 3 will be in 2 weeks, and it's on tools, screening criteria, and appraisal. So using tools to manage your screening process, testing those inclusion and exclusion criteria, how to do that quality appraisal, open access publications, using some tools such as Open Science Framework to, one of the things is to publish to your protocol, but there's other uses as well, all with the goal of reproducibility. I'm just going to see if I can advance that, and maybe we are at the end of our slides. I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to thank you all for your attention today and for your questions. And we warmly invite you to reach out to your subject librarian at UBC Library, and we look forward to your questions and to collaborating with you.